I am Miller Files, and today I open a case that has haunted Baltimore for more than 2 decades. A case wrapped in silence, rushed assumptions, and a girl whose final day is still shrouded in the cold mist of January. Before her name became a headline, before her story turned into a battleground of arguments and theories, she was simply Min Lee, an 18-year-old high school senior who left her school on January 13, 1999, and never made it home. The morning of that day looked ordinary on the outside. Woodlawn High School buzzed with the same familiar rhythm. Students moving through snow-stained sidewalks, teachers preparing for another long afternoon. In the center of it all was Hey, moving between classes with the quiet confidence of someone who had her life planned out. She was bright, determined, loved sports, and carried herself with a kind of youthful certainty that made her disappearance feel even more violently out of place. The last confirmed sighting of her alive was just after school let out. A normal moment, a girl walking toward her car. The kind of moment that seems meaningless until it's all you have left. She was supposed to pick up her cousin afterward, something she never missed. When she didn't show up, concern turned to fear. Her family called her phone. Friends retraced her routine. Hours passed. No word. By nightfall, she was reported missing. I remember looking at the missing person notice from that evening. Her face was calm, almost too calm for the weight it would come to hold. Cases like this, when a young woman disappears without any sign of struggle or witness, are the ones that unsettle investigators the most. Abductions leave noise. Violence leaves traces. But Hayes' disappearance was an empty space, a silence that felt engineered. The Baltimore County Police began their investigation, but the early hours were slow. No forced entry, no sign of a planned escape, no immediate suspects. On paper, she simply vanished. In reality, something terrible had already happened. 6 weeks later, on February 9, 1999, a call came in that shattered the illusion of hope. A man who had stopped to relieve himself in a wooded area of Leakin Park found something on the forest floor. A partially buried body. The soil around it had settled oddly, as though whoever hid it didn't care to do the job well. A few inches of dirt, leaves disturbed by winter wind. The body had been there for weeks. The medical examiner confirmed what everyone feared. It was Min Lee. Her cause of death was manual strangulation. The bruising on her neck was clear. There were no signs of sexual assault, no knife wounds, no gunshot. A killing committed with bare hands, up close and personal. That detail alone shifted the tone of the investigation. Strangulation isn't random. It's intimate. It requires time, proximity, and intent. Yet even with her body found, no path led investigators closer to the truth. No tire marks, no footprints, no fibers that pointed to a suspect. It was as though the forest swallowed everything but her. When I look at the early detective reports, what strikes me is the absence of patience. Instead of letting evidence guide them, investigators made a sharp turn toward a single name, Adnan Syed, Hassi's ex-boyfriend. 17 years old, no criminal history, a student known for being soft-spoken and respectful, but to the police he became the story they needed. Young love turned sour. Jealousy as motive, an emotionally charged narrative built faster than any forensic conclusion. Friends said Adnan and Hai had ended their relationship amicably. There were no threats, no patterns of aggression. But in the absence of tangible clues, investigators often follow the path of familiarity. And in the eyes of the case file, Adnan was familiar. I want you to feel the tension of those early days. A murdered girl, a forest that whispered nothing. a community desperate for answers, and a police department eager to wrap the case before it pulled them into a deeper labyrinth. This is where the story begins to split. On one side, the truth of what happened to Ha. On the other, the version that was assembled piece by piece, not from evidence, but from assumptions. When you reconstruct a case like this, you don't start with what people claim. You start with the timeline. The last confirmed moment of the victim's life, the last person known to see her, the window in which the crime could physically occur. Hey A left school somewhere around 2:15 a.m. p.m. Her body was found with no sign of defensive wounds, strong enough to indicate a prolonged struggle. This suggests the killer either attacked quickly or was someone she trusted enough to lower her guard. But notice this, there is no credible witness who saw her after she left the school parking lot. No proof she ever got into her car with anyone. Her time of death could not be pinned to a precise hour because the cold temperatures slowed decomposition. Everything in those early files is fog. And the fog is exactly where mistakes begin. The more I sift through the initial statements, the more I see a void. The police had no leads, no witnesses, and no traceable evidence. And when investigators feel cornered, they often cling to the simplest narrative. That narrative became Adnan, the boy who dated her, the boy who moved on, the boy others thought might still care. But let me tell you something from the perspective of a detective who has reopened dozens of cold cases. Simplicity is rarely truth, and in the disappearance of Ha Min Lee, simplicity was a trap. Part 1 ends here. At the moment before the investigation bends, before the first questionable witness enters the frame, before the story that would shape the next 20 years is constructed. In Part 2, I will walk you into the interrogation rooms, the shifting statements, and the moment the case took a turn that it never recovered from. But for now, remember this. The last day of Hay's life was ordinary, and sometimes the most ordinary days hide the darkest endings. This is Miller Files, and the investigation is only beginning. I am Miller Files. When I reopen this part of the investigation, it feels like returning to the moment a fault line first cracked beneath everyone's feet. If Hei's disappearance was the silence before the storm, and the discovery of her body was the blow that shook an entire community, then the arrival of a young man named Jay Wilds was the moment the earth shifted. It is the moment investigators stopped searching for the truth and began shaping one. In homicide work, timing is everything. Not only the timing of death, but the timing of stories. Who speaks first? Who hesitates? Who changes their memory to fit a growing narrative? 6 weeks had passed since Hasey's body was found. The investigation was drifting in dangerous waters. Too many leads evaporated under scrutiny. Too many assumptions dissolved when held up to the light. Without a suspect, detectives found themselves surrounded by long nights, unanswered questions, and the fear that the case would go cold. And then someone whispered a name. Not a lead, not a witness, just a name that drifted among the hallways of Woodlawn High School. That name was Adnan Syed. They circled him quietly at first. The ex-boyfriend who had moved on without much drama. The polite, 17-year-old who had no criminal history. The young man who stunned teachers and friends, not because he seemed capable of murder, but because they could not imagine him harming anyone. Yet, when investigators feel pressure, they begin to see patterns where there are none. A breakup became suspicion. A lack of alibi became motive. A teenager's ordinary schedule became a puzzle piece forced into the wrong place. But detectives still lacked the most important element needed to charge a suspect, a story, a narrative, something that could speak where evidence could not. And that is when the detectives turned to a young man who, on paper, had no connection to the murder. He did not date Huffy. He was not a close friend of Adnan. He was not present at the disappearance. Yet he would soon become the center of the case itself. His name was Jay Wilds. The first time I read the transcripts of Jay's interviews, I felt an immediate tightening in the back of my mind. Jay did not walk into the station with a confession. He was brought in for questioning related to something entirely different: small drug transactions, a few minor brushes with trouble. He was not a killer. He was not a violent man. He was someone who drifted on the edges of social life, knowing many people casually, but belonging to few groups fully. And perhaps that is why the detectives saw him as malleable, flexible, someone who could be shaped. His first story did not match the second. The second did not match the third. Every time detectives came back to him, the timeline stretched and twisted like warm wax. Times changed. Locations changed. The moment he allegedly saw Haze's body changed. They were all details that should have destroyed his credibility instantly. Instead, investigators treated the contradictions like soft clay. They pressed and molded until the shape resembled something they could use. Jay claimed that Adnan had killed Hay. He claimed that Adnan showed him the body, that he helped bury her, that he had been dragged into a nightmare he never asked for. It was the kind of story designed to shock, to satisfy an audience desperate for resolution. But there is a weight to truth. It is heavy, consistent, grounded in detail. Jay's story floated. It drifted. Every version he provided rewrote the previous one. When I read his words, I listened for the subtle things, the nervous gaps between sentences, the moments he waits for the detectives to respond before continuing, the way he rephrases a detail only after they guide him. These are the things that only someone trained to hear can detect. And in every line, I sensed the presence of invisible hands shaping the narrative behind the scenes. There is a moment in one transcript that told me everything I needed to know. Jay stopped his story, leaned back, and asked the detectives when Ha died. Not how, not where, when. A man who claims to have witnessed a murder does not ask when the murder occurred. That question alone should have shattered the case. Instead, the detectives simply redirected him back into the narrative. They needed him too much to let the cracks show. This is the dangerous part of an investigation. The moment when investigators, lacking physical evidence, begin to rely on the story instead of the truth. Jay became the vessel through which the entire case flowed. His hesitation was ignored. His contradictions were smoothed over. And every time a detail didn't fit, the detectives reshaped the timeline instead of the testimony. But why? Why would a young man willingly place himself inside a murder investigation? Why say he was at a burial site if he wasn't? Fear is one answer. Pressure is another. But there is also something darker. When a witness feels cornered, cooperation becomes survival. And the investigators offered him exactly what he needed to feel safe: a path out of trouble, as long as he helped them close the case. When the prosecution eventually built their argument, Jay became their anchor, their star witness, their irrefutable voice. They said he had no reason to lie. They said he had stepped forward reluctantly, bravely. They said he was the only one willing to tell the truth. But the truth is this: reluctant witnesses do not rewrite their stories 3 times. Brave witnesses do not ask what time the crime happened. And honest witnesses do not need detectives to guide them through their own memories. As Jay's narrative grew shackier, the prosecution added a new weapon: cell tower records from Adnan's phone. data that looked scientific, data that looked precise. But the truth was the opposite. Incoming calls could not be used to determine location. The phone company said so in writing, and yet the prosecution presented the data as if it were GPS. A fragile witness and fragile data became the pillars of the case. With each police interview, Jay's story became less about truth and more about survival, less about what happened to Ha and more about the story investigators needed to tell. And in that process, something irreversible occurred. The investigation stopped being a search for the killer. It became a mission to support a theory. Now, I want you to imagine this moment. A young man sitting in a small interrogation room, a team of detectives leaning closer, a blank timeline in front of them. Every detail that doesn't fit is erased. Every new version is praised. Every hesitation is dismissed. And slowly a narrative emerges, one that can be presented to the public, to the courtroom, to the world. But narratives built on fear do not age well. They fracture, they crumble, and this one would eventually shatter under the weight of truth. But at this point in our story, the cracks were still invisible. The detectives could not see them. The prosecution refused to see them, and the world was about to hear a story repeated so many times that repetition made it sound like fact. Part 2 ends in that small interrogation room, the air tense, the truth obscured, and a young man sitting under fluorescent lights, unknowingly setting the course of the next 2 decades. In Part 3, I will take you into the courtroom, into the strategies that buried logic, into the omissions that silenced doubt, and into the trial that shaped the fate of a young man whose story remains entangled in the shadow of another's lies. This is Miller Files, and the descent continues. I am Miller Files, and today I take you into the courtroom where everything that should have mattered stopped mattering, and everything that should have been questioned was accepted without a fight. If Part 2 was the moment when the investigation bent under the weight of a fragile witness, then Part 3 is the moment when the justice system allowed that witness to become the architect of a young man's fate. This was not a trial built on forensic certainty. It was not a trial built on physical evidence or eyewitness accounts or scientific verification. It was a trial built on a story, and stories, when repeated loudly enough, begin to sound like truth. The trial of Adnan Syed began with a quiet intensity. There was no eruption of chaos, no dramatic revelation, no packed media frenzy. Instead, there was a tension that seeped through the courtroom like a slow leak. Families on both sides sat in stiff silence, separated by grief and disbelief. One family mourning a daughter whose life was taken too soon. Another family staring at a 17-year-old boy, trying to believe that the justice system would see what they saw, that he was not the kind of person who could take another human life. But the courtroom is not a place where truth speaks for itself. It is a place where truth must fight to be heard. And in this courtroom, truth did not stand a chance. The prosecution began by painting a picture, not with evidence, but with emotion. They showed the jury a narrative of young love turned violent. They described jealousy festering beneath the surface. They claimed Adnan could not accept the end of his relationship with Hawkeye. And when a prosecutor wraps a story in enough certainty, jurors begin to fill in the gaps themselves. They imagine arguments that never happened. They imagine rage that was never witnessed. They imagine a monster where there might only have been a confused teenager. Then came the centerpiece of the state's case, the testimony of Jay Wilds, the star witness, the man whose story would become the spine of the verdict. Jay walked into that courtroom carrying the weight of a narrative that had been shaped, reshaped, and sanded down to fit the prosecution's needs. He spoke softly. He hesitated at the right moments. He appeared uncomfortable, fragile, haunted, and the jury, untrained in the art of reading unreliable witnesses, interpreted those signs as sincerity rather than uncertainty. He told them that Adnan killed Haya. He told them that he helped bury the body. He told them that Adnan confessed to him, and the prosecution, knowing the contradictions buried in Jay's earlier statements, made sure that the jury never heard the full extent of those changes. They presented him as a reluctant observer, someone dragged into a nightmare he never wanted. That is the kind of character juries trust. A person who appears unwilling to testify seems more honest, and Jay played that role well. But I have seen this performance before. In other cases, in other trials, in other rooms lined with wood and silence. It is the performance of a witness who knows his safety depends on consistency, and consistency depends on rehearsing the latest version of the story. And what about Adnan? The boy accused of murder stood in the courtroom with a calmness that was misinterpreted as coldness. He did not look like a killer, but prosecutors painted his composure as manipulation. They said his calm demeanor showed calculation. They said his kindness showed deceit. They said his silence, where he should have reacted, was evidence of a guilty mind. In reality, he was a teenager standing in the middle of a storm he did not create, trying to hold on to a life slipping through his fingers. There was no physical evidence tying him to the crime. No DNA, no fingerprints, no fibers, no signs he had ever been in Leakin Park, no proof he had ever been in AI's car on the day she disappeared. The prosecution had none of it. They had only Jay, and they had the cell phone records. This brings us to one of the greatest miscarriages of logic in the trial. A stack of phone records was presented as scientific proof that the timeline Jay described must be true. But behind the pages of numbers was a truth. The jury never heard incoming calls, cannot be used to determine location. The phone company said so clearly. Yet the prosecution ignored it. They presented the records with a confidence that made jurors believe the data was precise, objective, and unshakable. It was not. This combination, the unstable witness and the unfit technology, built a wall the defense could not break down. They tried. They pointed to inconsistencies. They asked why the state's timeline changed. They asked why Jay's story shifted. They asked the obvious question, how can a case with no physical evidence be believed? But their questions were swallowed by the prosecution's certainty. The jury listened, they watched, and slowly, detail by detail, they accepted the narrative laid before them. There was a moment in the trial that stands out to me even now, a moment when the prosecutor leaned forward and told the jury that sometimes the absence of evidence is evidence of guilt. It is a sentence that violates the very principles of justice. Yet in that courtroom, it went unchallenged, and when such ideas go unchallenged, they root themselves in the minds of jurors. The defense argued that Adnan had no motive. The prosecution responded that motive is not required. The defense argued that Jay's story contradicted itself. The prosecution responded that trauma causes memory to change. The defense argued that the phone records did not support the burial timeline. The prosecution responded that technology is not perfect, but motives are. With each rebuttal, the foundation beneath the defense crumbled, not because the prosecution was right, but because the prosecution was confident, and confidence wins trials more often than evidence. By the time closing arguments arrived, the narrative had fully solidified. The prosecution told the jury that the case was simple, that Adnan killed Hai because he could not let her go, that Jay helped him dispose of the body, that the phone records proved everything. None of it was simple, but simplicity is seductive. And in that courtroom, it was victorious. The verdict was delivered in a silence so heavy it could have crushed bone. Guilty, the word spilled from the foreman's mouth like a sentence for both families. One family collapsed in grief, the other collapsed in shock, and a 17-year-old boy was led away in handcuffs, carrying a future that no longer belonged to him. But even in that moment, the truth was not dead. It was only buried. Buried under the weight of testimony shaped by fear. Buried under data presented without context. Buried under a system too hurried to see the cracks forming beneath its own steps. As Part 3 closes, we step out of the courtroom and into the long shadow of a verdict that would take decades to unravel. A verdict built on the illusion of clarity. A verdict that would spark the fight of a lifetime. In Part 4, I will take you into the years that followed. The appeals, the discoveries, the voices that rose from the dark, and the quiet truth that refused to stay buried. This is Miller Files, and the pursuit continues. I am Miller Files, and this chapter opens in the quietest place of all, the years after the verdict. Trials end with dramatic crescendos, but what follows afterward is far more suffocating. It is the stillness where the system expects silence, where the public moves on, where a young man is left to absorb a life sentence inside a concrete box. And it is in this silence that truth often begins to stir. Adnan Syed entered prison at 17 years old, not yet an adult, not yet finished with high school, not yet experienced in life. He walked through steel doors with the weight of a murder conviction pressing down on his shoulders. In those early years, he lived in a space between shock and disbelief, always repeating the same thought to himself. This cannot be real. But reality does not loosen its grip simply because someone is innocent. Time moves the same way for the guilty and the wrongly convicted. Days turn to months, months turn to years, and innocence becomes something you must fight for, even when the world has already decided to stop listening. For a long time, no one questioned the verdict. The prosecution moved on. The detectives closed the file. The community accepted the story they had been told, and High-E's family, still grieving, believed the case was resolved. In many ways, the silence was convenient. No new evidence surfaced. No witnesses came forward. No alternative suspect was pursued. It was as if the world had placed a tombstone over the entire case. But truth has a strange habit of knocking long after the door is closed. It began with small voices, letters from people who had doubts, advocates who specialized in wrongful convictions, law students who read through the court transcripts and sensed that something was deeply wrong, friends who never believed the story to begin with. They gathered around the edges of the case, examining it piece by piece, like archaeologists, brushing dust off a buried ruin. And the more they brushed, the more cracks appeared in the foundation of the verdict. One of the earliest cracks came from a woman named Asia McLean. She was a classmate of Adnan. She wrote 2 letters shortly after his arrest, saying she saw him at the library on the afternoon Hage disappeared. Her memory placed him miles away from the alleged crime window. It was an alibi, clear and direct, but Adnan's defense attorney never contacted her. She was ignored, dismissed, left outside the courtroom like a witness. No one wanted to hear. Years later, her letters resurfaced, and the question they raised was simple but devastating. Why would a defense attorney ignore an alibi witness? This question would become one of the pillars of the appeals to come. But the legal system does not move quickly, even when the truth is screaming. Another crack came from the science itself. The cell tower evidence used in the trial was built on a misunderstanding so severe It bordered on negligence. Incoming calls could not be used to determine a phone's location, yet those calls were the very foundation of the state's burial timeline. The timeline that supposedly placed Adnan in Leakin Park. When experts reviewed the files many years later, they confirmed what should have been obvious from the start. It was scientifically invalid. The appeals began slowly. Motions filed and denied. Hearings scheduled and canceled. At every stage, the system resisted. Courts are built to preserve verdicts, not dismantle them. Overturning a conviction means questioning the competence of prosecutors, judges, detectives, and even juries. It means admitting that mistakes were made, and institutions rarely welcome humility. Then something extraordinary happened. In 2014, a podcast called Serial released its first season. It took the entire case apart, piece by piece, presenting the public with the inconsistencies, the questionable testimony, the unreliable data. It reached millions of people, and for the first time in 15 years, the world looked again. They did not see a clean prosecution. They saw something messy, something uncertain, something broken. Public attention is not the same as justice, but it forces doors open. After Serial, more eyes examined the case. Investigators, journalists, attorneys, and ordinary citizens began to question everything that had been accepted as fact. And the legal system, pressured by the sheer weight of scrutiny, finally began to move. Hearings were held. Lawyers argued that Adnan's trial attorney had failed him. Experts explained the misuse of cell tower records. Asia McClain testified under oath that she had been ignored. Each revelation weakened the original narrative, yet the prosecution continued to defend the conviction, insisting the verdict was sound. There is a strange thing that happens when truth begins to rise. The system does not crumble suddenly. It shifts slowly, reluctantly, like a massive machine grinding against the truth. And then, in one unexpected moment, it gives way. In 2016, a judge vacated Adnan's conviction. It was a moment of clarity, piercing a fog that had lasted nearly 2 decades. The judge ruled that the defense had been ineffective, that vital evidence had been ignored, that the phone data was flawed. For the first time, the system acknowledged the possibility that Adnan had been wrongfully convicted. But justice is never linear. The decision was appealed, reinstated, overturned again. Years passed in legal limbo. Adnan remained incarcerated, waiting, suspended between hope and despair. Appeals courts disagreed with trial courts. Technicalities overshadowed truth. Paperwork outweighed human lives. Then came the revelation that should have shattered the case from the beginning. Prosecutors uncovered evidence pointing to 2 other potential suspects. Evidence that had existed since 1999, but had never been disclosed to the defense. One suspect had a history of violence against women. Another had threatened High directly. This was information that could have changed the trial entirely. Yet it had been hidden in the shadows of the original investigation. Withholding evidence is not a small mistake. It is a breach of justice, so severe that it corrodes the foundation of a case. And in 2022, the prosecution finally admitted it. They acknowledged the errors. They acknowledged the questionable evidence. They acknowledged that the conviction could no longer stand. On a September day, after 23 years behind bars, Adnan Syed walked out of prison. He stepped into the sunlight, unsure whether to believe his freedom was real. Crowds gathered. Cameras recorded. But beneath the noise, beneath the celebration, there was a truth that struck me harder than anything else in this case. Freedom did not equal closure. Because Hae was still gone. Her family still had no answers. The real killer had never been found, and the investigation that should have uncovered the truth had instead covered it. That is the tragedy at the heart of this story. Not just the wrongful conviction, not just the botched investigation, but the years lost. The truth buried, the justice denied to both families. As Part 4 ends, we stand in a liminal space. A conviction overturned, a suspect freed, a case cracked open once more. But no resolution, no closure, no justice. In Part 5, I will take you to the final chapter, the unanswered questions, the lingering shadows, the open ending that still haunts Baltimore decades later. And I will tell you what I believe truly happened. This is Miller Files, and we are approaching the final descent. I am Miller Files, and this is the final chapter. We stand now at the edge of a story that has spanned decades, where answers remain elusive and the truth floats somewhere between what was said, what was forgotten, and what was never revealed. If the previous chapters were about the silence, the witness, the trial, and the long fight for justice, then this chapter is about everything that still lingers in the dark. The open questions, the lost possibilities, the ghosts that refused to leave. When Adnan Syed walked out of prison after 23 years, the world believed the case had finally reached a turning point. Cameras showed a young man regaining his breath. Journalists called it vindication. Supporters saw it as the triumph of truth. But when I looked at that moment, I saw something deeper. I saw a void. Because freedom for one man does not answer the question that haunts every investigator who killed Ha-Hee Min Lee. To understand how a case can unravel so completely, we must return to the evidence that never received its due scrutiny. During the reopening of the investigation, prosecutors identified two alternate suspects, men who were never fully pursued, men whose names should have been shouted from the rooftops in 1999, but were instead buried in sealed files for decades. The first potential suspect had a documented history of violence against women, a pattern that should have triggered immediate alarm. He had threatened a girlfriend in ways chillingly similar to the circumstances around Abi's death. And yet his name was never brought before the jury, never considered by Adnan's defense, never explored properly by investigators. His presence in the case lurked like a shadow behind a closed door. The second potential suspect had made explicit threats toward AI shortly before her disappearance. Threats that, if revealed during the original investigation, would have changed the trajectory of everything. Someone threatening a young woman who was later found strangled should have been at the center of attention. Instead, he vanished from the narrative, buried under the pressure to close the case quickly. Why were these suspects ignored? Why were their histories concealed? Why did the investigation narrow so quickly onto one person while overlooking others whose motives were stronger, whose behavior was more alarming, whose pasts carried warning signs as bright as flames? The answer is painful but simple. The system committed itself to the wrong story. Once investigators locked onto Adnan, every other possibility dimmed. Every alternative theory faded. And the tunnel vision that followed ensured that no one else was ever truly examined. But even if we turn away from the ignored suspects, there remains another shadow in this case. The physical evidence, or rather, the absence of it. No DNA tied Adnan to the crime. No fingerprints, no fibers, no connection to Leakin Park, no witness who saw him with Hay after school. In the years since the original trial, advances in forensic science have made it clear that many wrongful convictions fall apart precisely because the physical evidence never supported the prosecution's theory to begin with. And yet here we are. The physical world remains silent, refusing to point to any one person. There is another truth that investigators cannot ignore: statistical reality. Most victims of manual strangulation are killed by individuals with a history of violence, often connected to them through patterns of control or intimidation. Hay had no such history with Adnan. Their breakup had been uneventful. There were no threats, no arguments witnessed by friends, no whisper of anything resembling violence. But one of the alternate suspects did have this pattern, and the fact that this was never fully investigated remains, to me, one of the greatest failures of the original investigation. As I went through every piece of this case, examining the transcripts, the interviews, the letters, the phone records, and the forgotten reports, one conclusion became unavoidable. This case was never solved. It was simply ended. There is a difference. Ending a case means closing the file, securing a conviction, and moving forward. Solving a case means finding the truth. And truth was never found here. The death of Ha-Min Lee remains suspended in a space where logic, fear, and missteps collide. The justice system failed her by choosing certainty over caution. It failed Adnan by believing a story instead of demanding evidence. It failed the public by presenting a narrative built on fragile ground. And it failed the truth by refusing to look into the darkness long enough to see what was there. As I stand here reviewing this final chapter, I am struck by the unspoken cost of these failures. A young woman lost her life. A young man lost decades of his. Families were broken. Trust was shattered, and the real killer, whoever he is, walked away untouched, unchallenged, perhaps certain the world would never turn its eyes toward him again. But cases like this never truly die. They wait in drawers, in memories, in the quiet places detectives revisit years later. The truth does not disappear. It simply waits for the right moment, the right question, the right piece of light to reveal itself. And so, I cannot give you a name. I cannot point to the killer. I cannot solve what the system refused to solve properly. But I can tell you this: there are shadows in this case that were ignored. There are suspects who deserved more scrutiny. There are questions that should have been asked. There are silences that should have been broken. The investigation must continue, even if slowly, even if quietly, for Hadi, for Adnan, for the truth. This is Miller Files, and though this is the final chapter, the story is not over.